Let's talk about Hans Christian Andersen's The Steadfast Tin Soldier. In my last video over the Nutcracker, a few people mentioned this, and I thought it was a good time to do it because I've been meaning to for a while. Even though it's a fairly short story, there's a lot to dig into and unpack. So a boy gets this set of tin soldiers on his birthday, and they've all been cast from this one old spoon, made of tin, obviously. There's 25 of them, but the last one is missing a leg, which you can kind of see in this picture, because there wasn't enough tin left to complete him. Already there's a lot to think about with this protagonist. He is incomplete, he feels broken, he doesn't have all the parts that his counterparts have. And most fairy tales are about animals or people, or even like in Pinocchio, when it's about a doll, it's alive and it's animated. And while he is alive, he is the most passive protagonist in any fairy tale I've come across. One thing he can do, however, is gaze at this paper ballerina who lives in a paper castle across the toy room. She also never moves or speaks in this entire story. She's got a glittering tinsel or sequin star that's often translated as spangle on her dress, and because she has one leg up, it looks to him as if she also just has one leg. But the Tin Soldier decides that even though she is too grand for him, presumably because she's beautiful, she's in this castle, he thinks she is the wife for him. Those are the words. Now, the only time that he does actively do anything in this story or move himself at all is by laying himself behind a snuff box to where he can lay there and look at the girl without her seeing him. Does not think about approaching her or trying to get with her or talking to her or finding out what kind of person she is. He wants to spend his days staring at her and her not knowing it. Now, this can be read as incredibly creepy and gross, which is my gut reaction. Maybe because I'm a woman, maybe because I spend time analyzing literature through gender lenses. Or it's an expression of his absolute shyness. He loves her, he wants her, but he accepts from the get-go he's never gonna have her, and so all he wants to do is just look at her and accept his fate. So an interesting thing about this story is even though the ballerina and the tin soldier never move, they're the only ones. At midnight, the witching hour, all of the other toys come to life in a very Toy Story sort of way. They walk around, they talk, they behave as humans. And if there is an antagonist in this story, it is this goblin or troll or bogeyman, depending on how you translate it from the Danish. He lives in the Jack-in-the-Box and seems to have taken the form of the Jack-in-the-Box. He sees the Tin Soldier looking at her and he's like, dude, you're gonna regret that. Obviously because he seems to also love the ballerina and is jealous. He's like, take your eyes off her, you're gonna be sorry, but he doesn't, which I guess is somewhat of an act of agency once again. He chooses to not do what the antagonist says. But the next day, he falls from the windowsill and into the street below. It's never stated that it's the goblin who made this happen, but he believes it is. Some boys find him in the street and they put him in a little paper boat and sail him along in the gutters, and he ends up going into the sewer system. He meets this angry rat who says that he needs to pay a toll. So after he goes down the storm drain, he sinks down, whirling into the darkness in a sort of symbolic death, or maybe sinking is like falling in love. And in a very Jonah and the Whale moment, or even Pinocchio in the Great Fish moment, he gets swallowed by a fish, which is again death and transformation. Again, it's either amazing coincidence or fate or whatever, but that fish ends up getting caught and sold in the marketplace and then bought by this Tin Soldier's original family in the home he came from. They open up the fish to cook it and find the Tin Soldier inside, and they have to know it's their Tin Soldier. It's a real weird coincidence that it's missing the leg, but they don't seem as amazed by this as I would be. Kind of like, okay. They give it to the children and the children start playing. Then for no reason that is mentioned whatsoever, one of the kids throws the Tin Soldier into the fire. Is this the work of the goblin again, or is this a cold, uncaring world where we have control over nothing and are at the whim of fate? Flames are also often purifying and they melt away impurities. And so he starts to melt, but the story is not quite over yet because a gust of wind blows the paper ballerina into the flames with him. They're both consumed by the fire, and when the maid cleans the fireplace in the morning, she finds that the Tin Soldier has melted into a lump of tin in the shape of a heart. Because the ballerina was paper, nothing is left of her except her spangle, which is now burnt black as coal. And that's the end. Lots of Andersen stories end with the protagonist dead at the end, but most of them don't see the death as necessarily bad. In The Little Match Girl, she goes to be with her grandma. In The Little Mermaid, she gets a soul. In The Red Shoes, even, she isn't tormented by the red shoes anymore. And along those lines, this death seems to come across as kind of a relief, a release of suffering and a new chance for someone who failed in life. So most people read the Tin Soldier being steadfast as him being resolute in his love and enduring lots of trials. This devotion is seen also in the fact that he is a soldier and he is duty bound by that. Even though he never speaks or does anything, we know he can because there's at one point where he considers shouting for help, but then chooses not to because he's in his soldier's uniform and it would be unseemly. Which is a lot, to be willing to endure whatever fate comes your way rather than commit an impropriety. Steadfastness is definitely a good character trait to be able to endure unpleasant things that you can't control, but allowing them to happen the way he does almost feels masochistic. The ballerina is also interesting because she is an object like him, but she really gets objectified. We never know what she thinks or feels through the whole story. She is an object the soldier wants and the goblin wants, and in the end, she dies, and she doesn't even get to melt into a heart. The only thing that's left of her is this fancy thing that was on her dress, this superficial part of her, and it's worthless now. It doesn't even shine. One critic wrote that she is punished for her vanity, which is silly because, I mean, there's a mirror in her castle, but she's not the one who put it there. But more importantly, she is punished for not having responded to the silent, unspoken desires of the male protagonist. Maybe if you talk to her instead of creepily staring at her from behind the snuff box? Almost universally, critics agree that the Tin Soldier seems to reflect the frustration in Anderson's real life. He seems to have fallen in love a lot with men and women, but never gets that love reciprocated. One person he was famously obsessed with is the Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind. And even though, like I said, there's arguments he may have had crushes or interest in men, he definitely seems to have failed to ever have a real meaningful connection with a woman in his life the way that he wanted. And this frustration seems obvious in the story. From a modern perspective, though, I can't help but look at it and think, well, maybe if you treated them like people or thought of them as people and not unattainable, objectified paper dolls that should read your mind, maybe that would have worked out. Critics also view this story as a mirror of Anderson trying to get a job at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. He wanted to be an actor, but he was rejected, as the theater put it, because he did not have the looks or the skills to be on the stage. I mean, ouch. This left him watching from a distance, again, like the Tin Soldier who never goes into the paper castle. However you want to read it, like most of Anderson's stories, it is incredibly relatable. Most people have felt like they weren't made right, that they're broken. Most of us have felt like we don't have agency, like the world is just events happening to us that we have no control over. We'd like to think that if we withstand it nobly, we will be melted down to the essence of who we are, and that essence is not a burnt-up cinder spangle, but a heart. Something beautiful and noble and good and worthwhile and lasting. Thanks for listening, and check out my podcast, Folk Tales and Fairy Lore. Link is in my bio. And check out my book, Dust Spells, a reimagining of the 12 Dancing Princesses, where the female characters definitely have agency and the romance does actually exist.